Good afternoon and welcome to your July Wellness Seminar, Emotional Intelligence for Leaders. I'm your host, Horatio Neely. Before we get started, I have a couple of housekeeping updates. One, today's seminar will be recorded and posted to the Wellness page. And during the seminar, your chats can only be viewed by the presenter and myself. Your speaker today is Doug Noll. He speaks and teaches people how to solve difficult, intractable, and highly emotional problems. He was a business and commercial trial lawyer for 22 years before turning to leadership development, problem solving, and peacemaking. He's a senior consultant with Mobius Executive Leadership and maintains a high-level mediation and arbitration practice. In today's seminar, he'll unpack the concept of emotional intelligence and how this foundational skill changes everything. Without further ado, I present Doug Noll, your facilitator today.
Thanks, Horatio. Everybody noticed that your chat is probably disabled, but on your screen you should see something at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. So that's where you can ask questions. And I've got that box open on my computer. So if you have a question as I go along, just type it in, and I'll do my best to answer it. So everybody's heard of emotional intelligence. And I have studied emotions for over 25 years. I got into the study of emotions through neuroscience when I was working on my master's degree in peacemaking and conflict studies, because as a peacemaker, I deal with strong emotions all the time. And I wanted to really dive deep and try to understand more about what this thing is. And I came up with some really startling information that most people have never heard about. When we attack a subject like emotional intelligence, we have to be really careful, because there is a schism in emotional intelligence between the academic people that do the research and the commercial people who go out and tout themselves as being able to teach you emotional intelligence. The first thing that I want to tell you is you cannot learn emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence was a phrase coined by Mayer and Solovey in 1991. As they were studying different kinds of social intelligences. And emotional intelligence was an intelligence that describes three basic emotional competencies, which I'll talk about more later on. But when you talk about learning emotional intelligence, since emotional intelligence is a test, it would be kind of like talking about learning IQ. And you can't learn IQ. You can do things to improve your IQ, but you can't learn it. So we need to be very careful about that. The other thing to understand about emotional intelligence is that this is a developmental process. I teach a system that allows you to develop your emotional intelligence quite quickly, in 4 to 6 weeks. But I do it in a very counter-normative and counterintuitive way. And so you just have to understand that a 1-hour seminar is not going to teach you emotional intelligence. What I hope to do is to pique your curiosity and motivate you to go out and learn more, and maybe start developing your own emotional intelligence by growing your own emotional competencies. So having said that, let's jump into this. First of all, I want to start with some concepts that will, again, are counter-normative. These go against conventional wisdom, but they're based on neuroscience. The first basic concept is that we are not born with emotions. We are not born with emotions. We're born with something else. We are born with something called affect, A-F-F-E-C-T. And the reason that I have the picture of all these babies up here is because a psychologist by the name of Sylvan Tompkins in the 1960s studied infants from birth to about 4 or 5 months old and recognized that because the emotional centers of their brain had not matured, he was trying to understand what it was that they were experiencing and demonstrating. And if you look at these babies, you say, yeah, these babies are emotional. But they're not emotional, because the parts of their brain that are responsible for emotions have not yet gone online. They haven't been developed yet. What these babies are showing us are 9 different physiological states that we call affect. And these affective states do correspond to what we would later call emotions, but they are not truly emotions themselves. So understand, we're not born with affect. Emotions are constructed from affect. And we start constructing emotions as toddlers at about 18 months of age when we begin to verbalize, when we begin to speak. And what we're going to do is take these 9 different affect, which there are 2 positives, excitement and joy, 1 neutral, which is surprise, startle, and then there are 6 negative affect, which include anger, rage, disgust, dismay, distress, shame, humiliation, and fear. And you've got these 9 different physiological states that we can have that arise in our brain and our bodies. And it's like an artist palette. And what you do, what happens is we're mixing and matching these different affects. And so we get an infinite number of combinations of affective experience that we now have to make sense out of. And that sense making is called emotion. And so we learn how to construct emotions and label them at an early age, if all goes well. But as I will explain in a little while, all does not go well for most of us. And we are hugely deficient in our ability to understand emotion and be emotionally intelligent. So one of the things that I always tell people is when you're listening to somebody who's talking about emotional intelligence, the first thing that you want to determine is, do they even define what emotions are? And this is the definition of emotions. They are biologically based patterns of perception, experience, physiology, action, and communication that are culturally created in our brains. And that culturally is highlighted because emotions vary from culture to culture. Here in America, US, we have emotions that don't exist in Finland. And people in Czechoslovakia have emotions that don't exist here. And if you look at all of the thousands and thousands of various Asian cultures, they all have emotions that are wildly different than the emotions that we experience here in the United States. So if you want to really define what culture is, look at what the emotions are in a given culture, and that will tell you what the emotions are. And as young children, we assimilate this information, and that's how we become culturally educated about our system, because it's about the emotions that the people in our milieu, our family, all experience. So what is emotional intelligence? Well, emotional intelligence basically comes down to perception. And this is the ability to identify your own emotional experience in the moment as you're having it, and the ability to recognize emotions in other people. That's one aspect of emotional intelligence. The second aspect is called facilitation. And in this one, in this category, emotions are used to identify and prioritize important information. So emotions are telling us what's important at the moment that we have to pay attention to. The third aspect of emotional intelligence is understanding. And this is applying words to emotions with increasing granularity. It's a process known as affect labeling that I'll talk about and teach you how to do this in a little while. And the fourth aspect of emotional intelligence is regulation. And that is being able to manage your emotions and behaviors consciously as opposed to reactively. People who are not emotionally intelligent, in other words, they cannot access their emotions, they cannot recognize their emotions, they can't use their emotions effectively, they don't understand what they're feeling, and they're totally reactive, are said to have low emotional intelligence. And in fact, most people are very low in emotional intelligence. There was an interesting study done by Brene Brown, one of your Texans, and out of a study of over 7,000 people were asked to express the emotions that they experience throughout the day. And they only came up with 3 emotions. They feel happy, they feel sad, or they feel pissed off. And that's the extent of most people's emotional intelligence. They can broadly label their emotional experience with sad, happy, pissed off, but all the other thousands of nuances in their emotional experience are just beyond them. And so that raises the question then, why isn't everyone emotionally intelligent? And so we're going to ask a question. Horatio, what's the first poll? So the question is, humans are rational, which separates them from other species. No or yes? What do you think? Give us an answer. We'll give you a minute or two to figure that one out. Okay, Horatio, what do we got? Oh, split. A split decision. 45% say no, 55% say yes. Okay, well, think about that answer, because I'm going to answer it in just a second. So let's start with Western philosophy as a starting point. So for over 4,000 years, we've been told by philosophers and theologians that what makes us human is rationality. For example, Plato, an ancient Greek philosopher, saw reason and emotion as two horses pulling a chariot in different directions, while the charioteer, the mind, struggles to get them to work as a team. Aristotle asked the question, what distinguishes human beings as a species from other animals? And he said it was the capacity for reason. In the 17th century, Immanuel Kant, a very famous German philosopher, said, emotions are bad, rationality is good. So we've been taught, we've been taught for 4,000 years that what separates us from other animal species is our rationality. But wait, it turns out that that's all wrong. It's all a lie. New insights from neuroscience, especially from people like Antonio Damasio, show us unequivocally that we are 98% emotional and only 2% rational. Now, if you can't take anything away from this talk today than this is the most important insight. And when I got this insight back in the mid-90s, it completely changed my life. And it will change your life too, as soon as you start seeing people as emotional beings, not rational beings. I teach a graduate course at Pepperdine University in California called Decision Making Under Stress and Conflict. And one of the things that my students learn is there's no such thing as rationality. And not only is there no such thing as rationality, there is no good definition of rationality. You can't even look to economics or philosophy or any other academic discipline and find a definition of rationality that works. And that's because human beings are inherently emotional and not rational. So there is no such thing as rationality. We are emotional beings. We can do critical thinking, and we have other skills that we can do to help solve problems. But fundamentally, we can't even invoke that sort of training until we're emotional first. And here's a quote that sort of emphasizes that. I never made one of my discoveries through the process of rational thinking. Albert Einstein. All of his stuff was done through emotional, intuitive thinking. So the number one problem we have why we're not emotionally intelligent naturally is because we have a culture that's biased against emotions. The second problem we have is our educational system. Our educational system is based on this myth of rationality. Well, the problem with the educational system is it is not keeping up with neuroscience. And again, neuroscience tells us that we're really good at solving problems, but we're not particularly good at relationships. And the reason for that is because we have two systems in our brain. We have the task-focused system, and we have the social system. And these are binary systems. That means that when the task-focused system is activated, the social system is turned off. And when the social system is turned on, the task-focused system is turned off. The social system is where our emotional intelligence resides. The task-focused system is where we've learned all these skills in school to make us be able to think. So education focuses on the task-focused system. And it's all about knowledge acquisition. It's about rules and procedures and algorithms. It's about learning critical thinking processes and reasoning and logic and probability analysis and quantitative and qualitative analysis and the scientific method. This is STEM education. This is what everybody emphasizes, so important that our children learn these things. And yes, they are important. They're very important, but we're neglecting a completely other part of our brain that needs training too. And we are not taught skills that strengthen the social system of our brain. For example, we are not taught empathy. And empathy is, I'm going to teach you how to do empathy in a little while. But empathy is something that has to be taught and practiced. We're not taught about emotions. We're not taught how to listen properly. We're not taught how to reflect. We're not taught how to calm or de-escalate ourselves or others. We're not ever taught anything about emotional intelligence. We're not taught how to be emotionally self-aware. And probably most damning, we're never taught how to reprogram our childhood triggers, which is a huge problem in adult life. I'll sort of foreshadow what I'm going to be talking about next, but most people stop emotionally maturing at 6 years old because of what goes on in their family. But 96% of all families are emotionally dysfunctional, and they produce emotionally dysfunctional adults. And those emotionally functional adults have children, and the process repeats itself. Now, we're pretty good at coping with stuff. We put together some pretty good barriers and put on a good facade, but as functional, emotionally mature adults, most of us are total failures. So we've got a cultural bias towards rationality and against emotions. We've got an educational system that fails to teach us the social skills we need and to strengthen our social system of our brain. And the final absolute deadly killer for us all is what's called emotional invalidation. So look at this little girl. She's obviously upset. And what are people likely to tell her? Parents or caregivers or adults. They're going to say something like, "Oh, it's not that big a deal. There's no reason to cry. But I do listen to you. You're not being rational." Imagine saying that to a 4-year-old. "Don't be sad. You're way too emotional. It can't be that bad. Get over it. You'll be okay. Don't be such a drama queen. Stop crying. You've got it all wrong." I've got a list, I've got a 5-page single-space list of emotionally invalidating statements that people use when other people are being emotional. And basically, we've learned from our parents to invalidate emotions. Again, because of this cultural bias against emotions, and 2, because our social system of our brain has not been properly trained. And so we resort to emotional invalidation in order to soothe our own anxiety around somebody else's emotional condition. Because our anxiety is so strong, we want to tell them to stop feeling emotional, so I'll start feeling good about myself. And so we tend to judge, criticize, ridicule, dismiss, disrespect the emotional experience of others, including children, at a very young age. So this is something we have all experienced. So we've got another poll for you. Horatio, bring up the next one. Number 1, how many of you have had somebody emotionally invalidate you? 2, how did it make you feel? And 3, how many of you have emotionally invalidated someone else? So take a moment and just answer those questions. Okay, Horatio, let's take a look at the results. Question number 1, how many of you have had somebody emotionally invalidate you? Almost everybody, and that's the normal response. And what were some of the experiences, emotional experiences that you had? How to make you feel? So we have people felt worthless, they felt unhinged, they lost trust in this person, they felt invisible, very common, they felt unworthy, and other emotions. So being emotionally invalidated is not a very pleasant experience. And the question then is, how many of you have emotionally invalidated someone else, especially a child? Even though when it's done to you, it's extremely painful. And look at the response, 82 to 19%. And that's very, very normal. We emotionally invalidate because it's what we experienced as children, it's what we were taught by our parents, and it's the only mechanism that we have learned unconsciously to soothe our own anxiety around other people's emotions. And that is the third reason why we don't develop emotional intelligence. How can you develop emotional intelligence when you're told not to cry, when you're told that emotions are evil or bad or weak, or don't be a girly girl, or put on your big girl panties and stop crying? When you're denied as a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old your full emotional experience because your parents get mad at you because you're expressing who you are as a human being, you are not going to be an emotionally intelligent person. It's impossible. And maybe later in life you can work through it and figure it out. But for the majority of your younger years, your emotional life is going to be a mess. And that's the way it is for many, 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 many people. All right, one other topic I want to cover before we get to the antidotes to all of this is leadership resistance to emotions. This is emotional intelligence for leaders. Many of you are leaders. I would say all of you are leaders because you have to lead yourself, if nothing else. But I work at a lot of different levels, from training murderers to be peacemakers in maximum security prisons to working at the highest levels of government, training senior analysts at the Congressional Budget Office how to de-escalate members of Congress. And I always have gotten a lot of pushback, especially in the business world, to the idea of emotions and emotional intelligence. And some of the common comments I get are, oh, this stuff's just too touchy-feely. Or, these are just soft skills, they're really not important. Or, again, if you're talking about soft skills, let me just stop right there. The term soft skills, which maybe many of you have heard before, was a term coined by the U.S. Army Training Command in the 1960s to describe all of the command skills necessary to control a battle space to assure victory in battle that didn't relate to firing a gun or driving a tank or operating machinery. Now, they were just called soft skills to distinguish them from hard skills as a way of categorizing the skills that a battle commander had to master in order to be effective. And yet we hear business people all the time dismissing soft skills as being touchy-feely or not real work. There are a lot of people who feel I got to be tough. We're the rugged individualist, which there has never been a rugged individualist in our country, and the myth of the rugged individualist is something that has been extremely destructive. I mean, if you look at people who say, well, what about the frontier period from 1840 to 1890? And I say, well, or the frontier was closed, I think, in the 1870s. You know how barns were raised? Even in Texas, barns were raised by communities. Communities were built by people coming together and cooperating and collaborating. We didn't build this country on individualism. We built this country on collaboration and cooperation and people working together to survive in really tough situations. So this whole idea of rugged individualism and the need to be tough and to be an isolated rock is just wrong. And I've already talked about rugged individuals. Here's the truth. The reason that we are all of these excuses why emotions are bad or evil or irrational or flies in the face of cultural norms is fear. Because I will say many, many people growing up never experienced emotional safety. And even in the most loving families, when you are emotionally invalidated, you are not going to experience emotional safety. And that's why emotional development stops at around 6 years old, because at 6 years old, children start to experience a lot of emotional abuse, not conscious abuse, but just by being invalidated, they are being abused. And so they build up barriers and walls and defenses to all of their emotions, and then emotions become something to be feared rather than something to be mastered. And by the time you get to adulthood, if you haven't had any training in how to master your emotions, then all you know is it's just this black hole somewhere inside of yourself where you feel unworthy, you feel shame and humiliated, you feel invisible, you feel like you're worthless or not worthy of being loved. And many, 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 many people have this experience. And if you're a business executive or a business leader, you feel like you have to conform to the stereotypical norms of our society and be, it's okay to be angry as a man, but heaven help you if you're a woman and you get angry, you're called a bitch. It's not okay for a man to show compassion, but it's okay for a woman to show compassion. I mean, the stereotypical gender roles around emotions are just crazy. And it's all based on fear, and the fear is based on lack of proper emotional training as children. So we got another poll, and then we're going to jump into the competencies and talk about how to develop these skills. How do we reverse all of this? What do we got next? Here we go. So what do you think? Emotions make me weak and vulnerable. Yes or no? Okay. How did we do? Yes and no. Oh, good. Fair number of people said no, they don't make you weak and vulnerable. That's great. And some people do feel that way. Excellent. All right, let me just tell you a little personal story before we jump into the competencies. Kind of how I got into all of this. So, as Horatio introduced me, I was a civil trial lawyer for 22 years. I lived in California, and I tried a lot of different lawsuits and a lot of different contested cases in front of judges and juries, federal court, state court, arbitrations, you name it, I did it. In the mid-1980s, I took up the martial arts, and by the time I was 40, I was awarded my second degree black belt. And my teacher then told me to go study Tai Chi. And so I did. And Tai Chi is very interesting because, first of all, it's the basis of all martial arts. Second, I'm sure you've seen videos of people doing the Tai Chi forms that look like they're flowing in the park. And so it doesn't look like it's much. But let me tell you, Tai Chi is the most deadly martial art there is. When you study it as a martial art, as I did, it's extremely powerful. But Tai Chi has two really interesting paradoxes. The first is, the softer you are, the stronger you are. And the second paradox is, the more vulnerable you are, the more powerful you are. Soft to be strong, vulnerable to be powerful. Well, those paradoxes did not click with me very well. Hardcore trial lawyer, secondary black belt, what? But I kept studying Tai Chi, and it was those paradoxes that caused me to leave the practice of law. I was trying a case in the late 90s, and all of a sudden the thought came to me, what the heck am I doing in here? And shortly after that, I made the decision that I was going to go back to school and get my master's degree in peacemaking and conflict studies and find better ways to resolve conflict other than through litigation. And in 2000, I just turned 50 years old. That'll tell you how old I am. I basically left $10 million on the table in my law firm, and I walked away with 1 week's notice to start my peacemaking practice. And it's that idea of being soft to be strong and vulnerable to be powerful and learning about emotions has completely changed my whole life and the whole way that I've looked at things. And I've changed the lives of thousands of people, tens of thousands, 20,000, dozens of thousands of people, getting them oriented to these skills. So let's talk about these three competencies. I'll go through them first, and I'm going to teach you the one skill that will allow you to grow your emotional intelligence in really 4 to 6 weeks if you practice it the right way. It's amazing how it works. So the three competencies are emotional self-awareness. So as I said at the beginning, you are emotionally intelligent when you are able to recognize and label the emotions that you're experiencing inside yourself in the moment. When I get up, we go sit in our hot tub. We're in California. We sit in our hot tub, and we live in the mountains of the central Sierra Nevada, and we watch the sun come up, and she asks me, how are you feeling? And I ask her, how are you feeling? And it forces us to do an emotional assessment so that we can talk about how we're feeling in the moment, what we're experiencing, to continue to practice this idea of emotional self-awareness. Now, most emotional intelligence training will tell you that you have to become emotionally self-aware. And the problem with most emotional intelligence training is that they don't have any good tools for teaching you emotional self-awareness. Really, the way that a lot of people develop emotional self-awareness is to go into therapy, which is completely impractical. So we'll talk about how we're going to develop our emotional self-awareness in just a second. The second competency is emotional self-regulation. Once I'm emotionally self-aware and I know that I'm angry or I know that I'm annoyed or frustrated, then I can make a choice about what behaviors I'm going to engage in response to that emotional experience that I'm having. If I'm not emotionally self-aware, then I cannot self-regulate, because what's going to happen is that the emotional centers of my brain are going to dominate over my executive function, my prefrontal cortex. And the only thing I have available to me is my childhood programming. And so I'm going to revert to that program reactively when I get into an intense emotional situation. All fights and arguments are all emotional. And all fights and arguments tend to start with reactive behaviors from people who are emotionally unaware and therefore cannot emotionally self-regulate. There's a condition called Alexithemia that I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but a lot of people suffer from it. It's the inability to express your own emotions, to feel or express your own emotions. And many, many people suffer from Alexithemia. They don't even know they have it. They've never heard of the term. As a person who works in conflict as a professional peacemaker, I see it all the time. And it's really the number one cause of all fights and arguments and conflicts, is this Alexithemia, not being aware and not being able to self-regulate. The third basic competency of emotional intelligence is empathy. There are two kinds of empathy: cognitive empathy and affective empathy. And I'm going to teach you how to be the beginnings of cognitive empathy. Now, so empathy is simply the ability to read another person's emotions, interpret what you're reading, assimilate them, and then reflect them back to the speaker, to the emotional person. So people will say empathy is walking in the shoes of another person. No, that's not true. That is not empathy. It is trying to understand what another person feels. Yeah, well, no, because empathy requires two parts. It requires you to read the emotions of another person, and it requires you to reflect back the emotions from the speaker's frame of reference. That is called cognitive empathy. It's a technique called affect labeling that I'll get to in just a moment. What I have learned over 25 years is that the way that you develop your emotional competency, and the way to develop it quickly and efficiently, is by starting with the third competency, which is to develop empathy. Once you start developing cognitive empathy, you start developing emotional self-awareness, and emotional self-regulation just happens automatically. And we are going to develop emotional competency through a skill called affect labeling. Affect labeling. So let me tell you a story about how I stumbled on this. It was 2005. I was mediating a very difficult case in Santa Barbara, California, between a couple that had been divorced for about 20 years. The husband was suing the wife over an $18,000 problem, and they each spent $50,000 in attorney's fees, fighting over this $18,000 problem. And the lawyers just threw their hands up and said, "Noll, can you fix this for us?" Because they were tired of their clients. So I said, sure, and I got this couple. They were well-dressed, upper-middle-class couple, well-presented, into a conference room. And I hadn't sat down after explaining what the process was going to be before they both stood up and started screaming vile insults at each other. I mean, if there had been knives on the table, there would have been blood on the floor. It was incipient violence. They hated each other. So I watched them for a minute or two, trying to figure, what the heck am I going to do? And the thought came to me out of the blue: listen to the emotions. So I sat them down, quieted them down, and I started with Susan. And I said, "Susan, what I want you to do is listen to John as he tells his story. And I want you to tell us what John is feeling. Just ignore his story, but what is he really feeling as he tells us his story?" So we did. And in the beginning, she struggled because she'd never listened to his emotions before. But eventually, within 10 or 15 minutes, she was getting pretty good. Oh, he's really angry. He's frustrated. He's upset. He's shamed. He's humiliated. I mean, and that's all she said to him. Just reflected back his emotions. And then when he finished telling his story, I had them reverse roles, and I had Susan tell her story, and John just tell Susan what Susan was experiencing emotionally as she told her story. And of course, they basically went through their whole relationship and why it went south and the problems and all the unresolved emotions they had. So they had a huge bunch of emotions that had to be revealed. Well, when Susan was done telling her story, there was a little bit of silence, and then John put his face in his hands and he started to sob. I mean, he did big racking sobs. And that went on for a couple of 2 or 3 minutes. Finally, he got up and got some Kleenex and blew his nose and cleaned himself up and looked across the table to Susan, and he said, "That's the first time you've listened to me in 25 years." And I was slack-jawed, stunned at what had just happened. And they settled the case right then and there. I didn't say a word. They figured out this is a stupid case. We wasted a lot of money and effort on this. Let's get rid of it. They agreed to get rid of it, be done with it, fire their lawyers, and get the whole thing over with. And then they walked out holding hands and had lunch with each other. And 4 hours before, they were ready to murder each other. Well, that was a pretty stunning result. And I knew what I'd done, but I couldn't believe it. So I started testing it in other intense conflicts. And I kept getting the same basic result. People calmed down immediately. And then a brain scanning study came out in 2007 out of Matthew Lieberman's neuroscience lab at UCLA, showing why affect labeling worked. I'm not going to go through the science today, but now I had brain science to explain why this technique worked. And so for the first 10 years, I just taught this as a way of calming down angry people, and I still teach it that way. Then the Prison of Peace project started, with, that my colleague Laurel Coffer and I founded in 2010. And this is where the big insight really came in, because as we started training, our first cohort of students were 15 women serving life sentences in the largest, most violent women's prison in California. And we started teaching, the first thing we taught them were these listening skills. And what was most amazing to us is for the first 5 weeks of training, we would come in once a week for a day and train. They were like blackthorns. They were shut down. They were emotionally defensive. They were surly, angry women. Week 6, we show up, and instead of these black thorns, there's these beautiful roses. They had actually been practicing listening to and reflecting emotions. And they had gotten in touch with their own emotions. And it was like somebody flipped a switch, and all of a sudden, these women had high levels of emotional intelligence. And they became the leaders in that prison as we ultimately trained over 800 women out of a prison of population of 3,600. We trained a huge number of women, and they became trainers. And we got an unsolicited letter from the warden a couple of years later saying, as a result of Prison of Peace, the prison was very quiet and couldn't be called the most violent prison in the world, most violent women's prison in the world anymore, because what these women had done was learn how to be peacemakers, and in that process they had developed their own emotional competency. As I began to teach this in my graduate courses and in seminars and workshops, I saw the same thing happening again and again, and finally it clicked on me that when we learn how to affect label, which is a form of cognitive empathy, we start to develop those emotional competencies of emotional self-regulation, emotional self-awareness, emotional self-regulation, and then, of course, cognitive and affective empathy. So here's how you do it. You practice this 3 steps. The first step is ignore the words. Ignore the words. We're all taught at a very young age to listen to people, listen to the words. In a human communication, words can be important, but there are 3 levels of communication: words, meaning, and emotions. And for this purpose, we want to ignore the words. The second thing you're going to do is guess at the emotions. And I'll show you how to do this in a second, or I'll give you some structure around it. But really, we have an innate ability to read other people's emotions. Again, I got curious about this, started doing some deep studying, and I learned that in evolutionary biology, humans did not have the ability to speak. We didn't have vocabulary until only 230,000 years ago. And the ability to talk, to create speech, was impossible before then because we didn't have the musculature or the brain power to create speech. But what happened was we mastered fire. And with the mastery of fire, we were able to render animal fat and make it digestible. And that protein-fat combination caused a huge expansion in our brain capacity. And over 10 or 15,000 years, the hypoglossal nerve and the laryngeal nerves and muscles and fibers in our vocal system and in our brain expanded dramatically to allow us to move from grunts to actual words. So how did we communicate as hominids for the millions of years that humans or hominids have been on the planet? We did it by reading emotions through nonverbal communication. So our brains today have inherited an exquisite sensitivity to the emotions that other people are experiencing. The problem is, because of what I talked about at the beginning, where we've got a culture and we've got an educational system and we have a practice of dismissing the importance of emotions, we just don't get a chance to use this innate part of our brain. But you've got it, and it's there, and you can use it. So all you need to do is ignore the words. Say, this is not a verbal communication. This is going to be all about emotions. And just be in silence. And your brain will automatically do the work. And the other person's emotions will start to come up inside your own consciousness. And as you start sensing what the other person is experiencing emotionally, all you have to do is reflect back the emotions with a simple you statement. So ignore the words, guess at the emotions, reflect back the emotions with a simple you statement. Don't ever use any of that old active listening stuff with I statements. What I think you're feeling is X. That is old, discredited, non-scientific garbage from the 1960s. It was developed by a psychologist named Thomas Gordon. Marshall Rosenberg stole it and rebranded it into nonviolent communication, and it doesn't work. If it did work, I wouldn't be here talking to you about this stuff. But so it's got to be a you statement, and this is where it gets a little difficult because, again, we're culturally habituated against telling people what they feel. So the most difficult part of this whole process is learning how to overcome the awkwardness of telling somebody what they're feeling. But once you do it and you see the result you get, it becomes self-affirming, and it will become an everyday part of your life, and you'll wonder how you ever got along not being able to do this. So I've got a video up, and I'm going to hope that it plays, because I wasn't able to enable the sound when I started the Zoom, but let's just see if it plays, and we'll see how it goes.
So Alea,
are we getting sound?
Well, I was actually in a meeting today with a couple people, but there were two people.
Hey, Doug, yes, you can go back, turn it back up. You were good. Sorry.
Are we getting sound?
It was
Yes.
so
Okay.
beyond rude. And I mean, I just feel so frustrated. I'm so frustrated that
and not heard and disrespected.
And that they're not even aware of how disrespectful they are. And I'm their senior. I'm the one that's actually overseeing this and getting them to do what they need to be doing.
And you're just kind of astounded that these people are...
I'm blown away.
Blown away by the fact that these people are so disrespectful, that they don't listen to you, they talk over you, you don't feel heard, and you're anxious about it.
I'm angry.
And you're really angry.
I'm really angry about it. It just makes me want to, like, not do this job. Get out.
So, I mean, you're so angry you're about to have it.
Yeah. I mean, if the money wasn't as good as it is, then it wouldn't be worth it. But it's not even worth. I mean, like, I toss and turn. My stomach, it clenches. I have heartburn. Like.
So you have a lot of upset and stress over this, a lot of anxiety.
Totally. Just these two people, like, every single meeting, they do this. They pull this thing.
And these people are just driving you nuts.
It's unbelievable.
And your anxiety level.
Okay, pause, Doug.
It looks like it. Let me see if I can get it going again.
Is proof.
Yeah.
And you don't know what to do with yourself.
Yeah.
And no matter what you try to do, it doesn't seem to work.
No, nothing works. Whatever I do, it makes it worse.
And you're feeling really deeply sabotaged and betrayed by these people.
Totally. Yes. Yeah.
Anything else?
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay, so there's a demonstration that was between myself and my wife of what affect labeling looks like. There a couple of questions have come up in the chat box, and this is a good time for me to take up the questions. So one question is, don't emotions lead to emotional-based thinking over rational and logical thinking? And I would say absolutely not. In fact, just the opposite is true. Emotional, what's called motivated reasoning, is a real problem today in our polarized society. And it's caused as a result of emotional unawareness, lack of emotional self-awareness. People don't even know that they are engaging in motivational reasoning. And so for those of you that don't know what motivational reasoning is, it goes like this. Supposing that you say, oh, I feel like a real nerd today. I must be a nerd. And what people do is they equate an emotional experience they're having that they can't even identify with who they are as a human being. And that's called motivated reasoning or emotional reasoning. And emotions lead to that when you don't have emotional mastery, and in addition to that, of course, you haven't developed your critical thinking skills. But just having critical thinking skills or being able to reason does not mean that you won't be subject to motivated reasoning if you don't have emotional mastery. Second question, this is a good one, and I want to calm your hearts. As a parent, here's what was in the question. As a parent of small boys, I'm concerned that I've already hurt my children's growth in this area. Hope you will tell us or provide the resources how we can improve what damage we may have already done. I get this question all the time, and here's the good news, is that you have not damaged your children. Now that you know what emotional invalidation is, you know to stop it. But the antidote to all of this is to start labeling your children's emotions as they come up. I have had parents tell me that even at 2 years old, they have been able to stop tantrums in less than 4 months. I mean, the tantrums go away forever by labeling the emotions of their 2-year-old who goes into a hissy fit. The studies show that if you affect label your children consistently over a 3 or 4 or 5 year period, by the time they're 12 years old and they're in their middle school, they are usually 2 grade levels ahead of their peers, and they have an emotional maturity way, way beyond their peer group. And it's because when you affect label, you're an emotional coach for your child. You're teaching your child and helping your child's emotional brain grow in a proper way. When you emotionally invalidate, you stop that growth. And when the emotional brain is properly developed, that's when the child will be an academic performer and be superior in terms of social ability. So you haven't destroyed your children's brains. Just start affect labeling today. This is how you begin to do this. Let's see. Okay, so when you affect label, a couple of things happen. Number one, you develop your own emotional awareness, because in order for you to be able to label somebody else's emotions and reflect them back, you have to understand what their emotions are. So you're beginning to develop your own emotional awareness. So it builds your emotional database so you can become more aware. It allows you to increase your emotional vocabulary from happy, sad, and pissed off, from that study of 7,000 people. Now here's the challenge that people have, that I finally figured out how to help people with this, and that is when they're starting off, because they haven't had any emotional training, they are emotions are unstructured data, and our brains do not access unstructured data very well. So what I've done is figured out how to structure emotional data in a way that you can access it. And if you're in a place where you can take notes or go back and look at the recording later, or I think the PDF is also going to be available of the slides, so you can go back and grab this later. But emotions come in layers. They don't come just one at a time. Usually emotions, there are 6 or 7 emotions that happen all the time. In that video of me labeling Alea, there were probably a dozen or a dozen and a half emotions that I labeled that she was having as she was describing a problem with a work group. So what are those layers? And if you can grab these layers, it can help you, it gives you a place to start when you're affect labeling. So layer number 1 is anger, frustration, annoyance, rage, and hatred. These are the anger emotions. And this is what we see, most frequently with people who are really upset. The next layer are what I call the dignitary emotions. Not really emotions, but they're close enough that these words describe the experience that people are having. Disrespect, feeling ignored, not being heard, unsupported, unappreciated, all kinds of words like that. The next layer are the fear emotions. Fear, anxiety, worry, concern, scared, frightened, terrified. The next layer is shame, humiliation, embarrassment, and guilt. The next layer is sadness, grief, distress, upset, gloomy, and unhappy. And the last layer, which is pretty deep, is abandonment, betrayal, feeling unloved, feeling rejected, feeling unlovable, and unworthy. Now, the way you use these layers are for yourself. What you do is, what's the first of these layers, of these 6 layers, what's the layer that is most obvious to you? Maybe it's anger. So you start out with saying, I'm really angry. In fact, I'm going to show you how we do this. So you'd say to yourself, I'm really angry. And so you're labeling your emotion. Or if you're labeling another person, you would say, oh, you're really angry. And then you would go to the next layer. And maybe you would stay in the anger layer and you say, I'm really annoyed. So that's annoyance is an anger emotion. I'm annoyed. Or you would say to another person, you are annoyed. Then you might move down a notch and you say, I feel really disrespected. I don't feel heard. I don't feel appreciated. I feel ignored. Or if you were saying it to a third person, you use a you statement. You feel disrespected. You don't feel supported. You don't feel heard. You feel completely ignored. Then you go to the next layer. I'm really anxious. I'm concerned. I'm worried. I'm nervous. Or if you were third-party affect labeling, you'd say, oh, you're really concerned. You're really anxious. You're worried. You're nervous. And then you could go to the next layer and say, I'm really sad. I'm unhappy. I feel depressed. Or you could tell a third person, you're really sad. You're feeling a lot of grief right now. And you're really unhappy and upset and distressed. And then you can always cycle back to the anger emotion, or this would be an anger emotion. I'm frustrated. Yeah, you're really frustrated. This all really just pisses you off. So that's how you practice it. Now, how do you put this into practice? A couple of guidelines to think about. Number 1, if you've got small children at home, I'm going to say 3 to 8 years old. This works great on them immediately. You can just practice on them, do one emotion at a time, use positive emotion as well as negative emotion. Oh, you're really happy right now. You're really excited. Oh, you're really sad. You're frustrated. You're mad, angry. And think of them as your little lab rats. And every time you label an emotion, watch their response. And the response you're going to get almost always is going to be, yeah. It's going to be a very declarative yes. It means you've done it right. I would not start on kids 9 years old or older until you have really got this perfected and polished, because they're going to smell a rat. And you're bringing into the house a whole new way of being that is going to be very disconcerting. So it's okay with the small kids. It's okay to do it with cats and dogs too. They love it. So practice on the small children. Don't practice on the older kids or teenagers, and do not practice this on your spouse for a while. You need to get some skill at this. The way that I tell people to practice this is to go into very safe, low-risk environments and read emotions and reflect them. And so where are those low-risk environments? I love Starbucks. You go into, the baristas are almost always in a good mood. You pay for your coffee and you say, hey, you're really happy today. And then you put on your metaphorical lab coat and just observe how this person behaves. How do they respond to you when you say something like, you're really happy? Oh, you look like you're really excited to be here today. And watch what happens. And again, you will see them smile and nod their head, and all of a sudden they'll tell you how their whole day is going, and you'll get all the people behind you angry because you've engaged this barista, but you're the first person who has validated this person's existence probably forever. And watch the behavior. Do the same thing in a restaurant. If you want to get the best service you've ever had, when your server comes up and introduces himself or herself, you look at them and get a sense. What are they feeling? And you can say, you're really anxious tonight, or you're stressed. You've got a lot of work to do, or you're really happy. Another place that you can practice very safely without risk is at the supermarket. You go to the supermarket, you get to the checkout, and you got the checker there checking your stuff and the bagger. Look at them and just get a quick sense of what are they feeling right now. Maybe they're tired, maybe they're bored, maybe they're happy. Just tell them what they're feeling. Oh, you're kind of bored. You're kind of waiting for your shift to get over. You'd be excited when your shift is over. Yeah. And look for that yeah. People are going to say yeah, or they're going to say exactly. Every time you get that response, you've done it right. And that's what you're looking for. You need to practice this. You need to make this a conscious practice. And you need to make it a conscious practice over a period of 4 to 6 weeks at a minimum before it will start to become habitual. And then over a period of time, as you start to see it work and as it becomes a self-affirming practice, you will see your own emotional intelligence grow like crazy. You'll become emotionally self-aware. You'll be able to regulate yourself. And of course, you'll be able to demonstrate cognitive empathy by how you reflect back to people. And you'll see a complete and total transformation in your life. So, I have only covered the tip of the iceberg on all of this. And like I said, in a 1-hour presentation, it is impossible for me to convey mastery to you. But I've given you enough that if you're really good at self-learning and you're DIY, do-it-yourselfers, then you've got enough to go out and start working on it, because I've given you the core concepts. However, if you need more, I'm available for coaching, training, speaking, inspiring greatness. There's how you contact me, Doug@DougNoll.com, and my website, of course, is DougNoll.com, and you can access blogs and YouTube videos and all kinds of information. Everything I've talked about today, I talk about in depth on my website. I've got some video courses up, so if you're interested, you can pursue all of that and reach out to me. I'm a solo practitioner. I don't have an entourage. I don't have virtual assistants, so I answer all my own emails. So feel free to reach out. I've got books that you can buy that I've written on all of this stuff. So totally up to you about where you want to go. And of course, access your NEAP benefits.
You know, Doug, before I get into that, man, I love participating in your sessions, primarily because it's so educational. And, you know, there was some key takeaways. I think one is just understanding affect labeling and how to move to those 3 areas. It's kind of intriguing. You talked about the impact of protein fat driving language, right? But moving us through the 3 areas around ignoring the words, guessing at the emotion, and of course, reflecting back reflecting the emotion back to them as well, using your you statements. I think overall, you know, Doug, this is, if you're willing, I'll work with the team. Maybe we'll bring you back. I am very interested in actually the whole reprogramming component and kind of going through that process of reprogramming, because you know, you talked about initially with there's 9 states of the affect, and we only really, you talked about fear, right? So we don't get into the other 8 states really. And so part of that is the programming component, being able to expand our reach, expand our emotions into those key areas. So as mentioned, what we have here is our NEAP benefits in reference to our, not only our 1-800 line at 866-212-6096, but really the gamut of services that we offer, from counseling even to our wellness services that we're offering today, and in reference to coaching. So Doug, we look forward to bringing you back. We thank you.